When Nero, a decorated police K9, refused to get into the squad car, Detective Eli Carter thought he was just tired. But moments later, the dog disappeared into a cornfield and uncovered something that would break open a cold case and a grieving heart. The sun was already sinking low behind the trees when Detective Eli Carter stepped out of the farmhouse, brushing dust from his sleeves. The old place was empty. No signs of forced entry, just broken windows, scattered furniture, and a smell of mold that clung to the walls like rot. Whoever had been here was long gone. He spoke into the radio clipped to his shoulder, voice calm and tired. Code 4. Looks like kids messing around. No sign of burglary. We're heading back. He clicked the mic off and turned toward the squad car, parked beneath a leaning oak tree. Let's go, Nero, he said without looking, expecting the familiar sound of paws on gravel. But the air behind him stayed silent. Eli turned. Nero wasn't at his side. The big German shepherd stood still at the edge of the cornfield behind the house, right where the wild grass met the stalks. His ears were forward, his body stiff. The dog's nose twitched in the air, slow and steady. One paw hovered slightly above the ground, like he was frozen mid-step. Nero, Eli called again, louder this time. Come on, boy. But Nero didn't move. He didn't look confused or distracted. He looked focused, sharp, like something invisible had suddenly drawn a line in the dirt and dared him to cross it. Eli sighed, tapping the car keys against his thigh. Don't do this, he muttered. They had worked together for nearly 6 years. He knew Nero's moods. Knew when the dog was being stubborn, and when something was wrong. This was wrong. He took a step closer. Nero, heel. That's when Nero let out a sound Eli hadn't heard in months. A low, rumbling growl, deep in his chest. His hackles raised slightly, just enough to be seen in the fading light. Then, before Eli could say another word, Nero bolted. The dog plunged into the cornfield like a shadow, vanishing between the tall stalks with barely a rustle. Eli swore under his breath and gave chase. Nero, he shouted, pushing through the corn, branches slapping against his face and arms. His flashlight beam cut through the green maze, but it bounced wildly with each step. This better not be a squirrel, he grumbled, heart pounding. But it wasn't. He could feel it now too, the shift in the air, the quiet that wasn't normal, the way the birds had stopped chirping. The way the field smelled, not like summer corn, but something older, colder, buried. Ahead, the corn thinned. A ditch cut across the land like a forgotten scar, lined with brambles and tangled roots. And at the edge, just visible in the half-light, stood Nero, his body tense. His nose to the ground, tail stiff and straight. He looked back once, just long enough for Eli to see his eyes. They weren't afraid. They were determined. Whatever he'd found, it wasn't nothing. Eli's breath caught as he caught up to him. The dog was digging, dirt flying behind him in steady bursts. No hesitation. Just purpose. And in that moment, Eli knew. This wasn't just a dog refusing to follow. This was a dog answering something only he could hear. Eli crashed through the corn behind him, flashlight bouncing wildly as stalks slapped at his arms and legs. Nero, stop! He shouted, frustration sharp in his voice. He didn't have time for this. It had been a long day, a dead-end case, and now his dog was charging off like a maniac into the fields. But even as he pushed forward, something deep in his gut twisted. Nero wasn't playing. He wasn't running for fun. His movements were too focused, too direct. The cornfield thinned out suddenly, giving way to a patch of overgrown brambles and a rusted barbed wire fence, half swallowed by vines. Nero didn't slow down. He ducked under the fence like he'd done it 100 times before, leaving tufts of black and tan fur caught on the wire. Eli cursed under his breath and climbed over, boots slipping on wet roots as he landed hard on the other side. Now they were in old land, forgotten land, the kind of stretch tucked behind crumbling barns and shuttered silos, where no one mowed the grass or fixed the paths. Ahead, Nero weaved through tangled brush and fallen branches, never looking back. He was tracking something. That much was clear now. His nose skimmed the ground. His ears flicked forward. He moved with a rhythm, like he already knew where to go. "Where are you taking me, boy?" Eli muttered, slowing down just enough to catch his breath. He glanced back toward the direction of the farmhouse. The trees had swallowed it. They were far now. Too far to call for help. Nero climbed down into a shallow gully, paws slipping slightly on the muddy slope. Eli followed, his flashlight beam catching bits of broken glass and rusted cans along the way. The air was cooler here, damp and still. Then Nero stopped. He stood at the base of a large, concrete pipe sticking out from the side of the gully. It was an old storm drain, long forgotten, hidden beneath roots and weeds. Water trickled slowly from the mouth, thick with algae. Eli moved closer, breathing hard. "What is it?" Nero stood frozen, nose twitching, then looked up and barked once. Sharp, then again, then a third time. Each bark echoed down the gully, bouncing off the wet concrete. Eli felt it in his chest. Not noise, warning. Nero stepped forward and began to dig, not frantically, purposefully. His front paws clawed at the ground near the pipe's edge, pulling up dark, wet soil in long, steady strokes. "Whoa, hey, slow down," Eli said, kneeling beside him. But when he reached out to pull the dog back, Nero growled. Not to bite, just enough to say no. Eli froze. He looked closer at where Nero was digging. The dirt there looked wrong, packed tighter, darker, as if something had been buried there recently. Eli's hands shook slightly as he reached for his radio. He didn't know what they were about to uncover. But he knew one thing for sure. Nero had just found it. Eli dropped to his knees beside Nero, brushing aside the loose soil the dog had already kicked up. His flashlight beam flickered as it hit something hard and flat just beneath the surface. Metal, old and rust-stained, crusted with layers of dirt and rotted leaves. He pulled his sleeve over his hand and wiped at the edge until he uncovered more of it. A hatch, a square iron door sunken into the earth like it had been swallowed by time. Nero kept digging, his claws scraping against the corroded edges, his breathing sharp and fast. Eli placed a hand on his back, not to stop him this time, but to steady himself. He moved the beam of light toward the hinges and saw it. Heavy chain, looped tightly across the hatch, secured with a rusted padlock. This thing wasn't just hidden. It was sealed, on purpose. "Jesus," Eli whispered. He reached for his radio. "Dispatch. This is Detective Carter. I need backup at my current location. Send a unit with bolt cutters and a medical team. Possible discovery. Underground structure. Over." The static on the radio filled the silence while he waited for confirmation. Beside him, Nero had stopped barking. Now he just whined, a low, broken sound that made Eli's stomach twist. "Hang on, buddy," he said softly, hand still resting on the dog's side. "We'll get it open." Minutes passed, long ones. Nero never sat down, never took his eyes off the hatch. His body was tense, alert, tail low, and still. He was listening, waiting. When the squad car finally arrived, its headlights cut through the dark trees like blades. 2 officers stepped out, one carrying bolt cutters, the other a flashlight. Eli waved them over without speaking. They saw the hatch. Their expressions changed. "This looks like something out of a horror movie," one of them muttered. "Just cut it," Eli said. His voice was flat, steady, too steady. The officer leaned down, struggled with the angle, but finally, with a sharp snap, the chain broke free. The lock clattered to the ground. Together, they pried the hatch open. The sound it made was awful, screeching metal, groaning like something alive had been trapped and didn't want to let go. Then came the smell. It hit like a wave. Rot, mold, something worse underneath, something wrong. Eli turned away, coughing, pulling his shirt up over his nose. One of the officers gagged. Nero backed up a step, growling now, low and guttural. Eli took the flashlight and aimed it down into the opening. A ladder led into blackness. The concrete walls were wet, stained, There was water pooled at the bottom, and there were other things too. Torn fabric, a plastic bottle, a small shoe. Eli's heart dropped. He swallowed hard, then spoke into the radio again. "Tell them to hurry." Nero moved beside him, leaning just over the edge, staring down into the darkness like he already knew what was down there. He didn't bark this time. He didn't need to. Whatever was waiting in that hole had been there too long, and Nero had just brought it into the light. Eli lowered himself into the hole, boots scraping the old metal rungs as he climbed down. The smell grew thicker with every breath, heavy with damp concrete and something else he didn't want to name. His flashlight beam bounced across the narrow cellar walls, grimy and cracked, lined with patches of mildew. Water pooled at the bottom, ankle-deep and icy. The place was silent, too silent, except for the soft drip of water and the quiet whine from above, where Nero paced by the hatch. The beam swept across the far corner of the cellar. That's when he saw her. At first, he thought it was a pile of old blankets. Then the shape moved. A girl. She was crouched in the corner, arms wrapped around her knees, trembling so hard it made her shoulders jerk. Her hair was tangled, stuck to her cheeks. Her feet were bare, cut and dirty. She flinched when the light hit her face. "Hey," Eli said gently, dropping to a crouch, flashlight angled low so it wouldn't blind her. "It's okay. I'm not here to hurt you. My name is Eli. I'm with the police." She didn't speak, just stared at him with wide, glassy eyes. "I'm going to get you out of here, all right? You're safe now." He glanced toward the ladder. "There's a dog up there. His name is Nero. He found you." Her lips moved, barely a whisper. "The dog?" "Yeah," Eli nodded. "That was him barking. He led us right to you." A tear rolled down her dirt-smudged cheek. Her voice cracked as she spoke again. "I heard him. Before I saw the light, I knew someone was coming." Eli's throat tightened. He reached slowly toward her. "Can I help you stand?" She hesitated, then nodded once. Her legs were unsteady, thin and scraped. He slipped his arm around her shoulders and held her steady as they moved. She leaned into him, every step shaky. The water sloshed around their ankles as they crossed the cellar floor. When they reached the ladder, she looked up at it and shrank back. Her whole body shook. Eli didn't wait. He clicked the radio on his shoulder. "I've got her. Female, approximately 12, alive but weak, requesting immediate medical evac." The voices above grew louder. Lights danced across the opening. Nero barked again, once, loud and sharp. "It's okay," Eli whispered. "He's waiting for you." With the help of the officers above, they lifted her out. As soon as she reached the surface, Nero rushed to her side, tail wagging slowly, body low. He nudged her hand with his nose and let out a soft whine. She dropped to her knees beside him and hugged him tight, burying her face in his fur. "Thank you," she whispered. Eli climbed out last, heart pounding, eyes never leaving the scene. She had a name, Mia. She'd been missing 5 days. 5 days in that dark hole. And the only reason she wasn't still there was Nero. He didn't ask for orders. He didn't wait for permission. He just knew. And he came for her. The scene above the cellar had turned quiet, the kind of quiet that comes with shock. Officers stood back as paramedics worked, their voices low and calm, hands moving fast. Mia was wrapped in a thermal blanket, her body limp from exhaustion. Her face was pale beneath the dirt, but her fingers clung to the edge of the stretcher like she was still afraid someone might pull her back down. Nero stayed right beside her, his body pressed against the grass, tail still, eyes locked on her face. One of the medics tried to guide him away, but he let out a warning growl, not loud, just enough to say no. Eli stepped forward, placing a hand on the medic's arm. "Let him stay, just until she's stable." The man nodded once and backed off. Eli crouched beside them, and that's when he noticed. Nero's front paws were torn. The pads were cracked open and raw, streaked with dried blood and clumps of earth. His nose, too, was bleeding slightly, likely from slamming into old debris while digging. His chest rose and fell with effort, faster than normal. Every breath seemed to take more from him. "You pushed too hard," Eli whispered, brushing a hand gently along the dog's back. "You knew she was there. You didn't stop." Nero didn't move, just kept watching the girl like nothing else in the world mattered. One of the officers near the hatch called out, "Detective Carter, you need to see this." Eli rose slowly, his knees stiff, and walked back to the opening. The flashlight beam from below had shifted, casting long shadows on the damp walls. The officer pointed silently toward the base of the ladder. That's where Eli saw them. Deep claw marks in the concrete, gouged into the wall like someone or something had fought to get out. And near the corner, smeared just above the waterline, was a bloody handprint. Small, fresh. It hadn't been old. Mia had tried. She had scraped the wall, screamed for help no one heard. But Nero had heard. He had clawed at the ground above that hatch until his paws split. He had forced his way through brambles, barbed wire, and a field no one thought to search. He had dug until the chain was visible, barked until backup came. And now, as the stretcher was wheeled toward the ambulance, he still wouldn't get up. He pressed his head against Mia's arm and closed his eyes, as if telling her she could rest now because he would keep watch. The medic paused at the doors, unsure. "We can't take the dog in the ambulance," he said gently. Eli didn't speak. He knelt down beside Nero and whispered, "She's safe now, boy. You did it. You can let go." Nero opened his eyes, just a little. His breath was shaky, but his gaze stayed on the girl. Then, slowly, finally, he lay his head on her blanket and let out a low sigh. He wouldn't move. Not until the wheels rolled forward. Not until she was gone. Not until he was sure she was really safe. The cellar should have been empty. That was what they thought. Mia had been found, the hatch had been opened, and the worst, it seemed, was over. But when one of the younger officers stepped back down into the pit to photograph the scene, he noticed something strange. A crack in the far wall. Not just a crack, an outline. The beam of his flashlight caught the faint shimmer of a hidden latch, half covered by moss and rot. "Detective," he called up, voice tight. Eli was still kneeling near the ambulance, watching as Mia was driven away, her small hand resting weakly on the stretcher rail. When the call came, he stood slowly and walked back to the hatch. Nero, though limping now, followed him, one step at a time. Back underground, the smell hadn't changed. It was still thick with mildew and old damp air, but the silence had grown heavier. Eli moved carefully across the floor, stepping over broken wood and scraps of cloth until he reached the far wall. He brushed his gloved fingers over the latch and gave it a gentle tug. It opened. With a groan, the panel swung inward, revealing a second chamber, even darker than the first. The air that spilled out was colder, older. And the moment the light swept across the space inside, everyone stopped breathing. There were toys scattered on the floor, dolls with matted hair, a stuffed animal missing an eye, a tiny red truck with chipped paint. They were coated in dust, but not enough to hide how recently some had been moved. Against one wall, there were chains bolted to the concrete, not rusty with age, but polished from use. A mattress, thin and stained, lay crumpled near the corner. And beside it, propped neatly on a plastic crate, was a small camcorder, battery pack still blinking red, still recording. Eli's chest tightened. He stepped inside, the floor creaking under his boots. One of the officers behind him swore under his breath. No one needed to say anything. The message was clear. Mia hadn't been the only one. There had been others, maybe recently, maybe years ago. But there were too many signs, too many things left behind by too many small hands. Eli turned to Nero, who had stopped just outside the doorway. The dog's eyes were locked on the room. His ears were flat. He didn't bark or growl, he just stood there, breathing slow and shallow, as if the weight of what lay behind that door pressed on him too. That's when it hit Eli. This hadn't been luck. Nero hadn't just caught a scent and followed it blindly. He had known. The moment they were near that house, he had felt it. Something buried, something wrong, something that called to him louder than any command Eli could give. He had followed it, through fields and fences, through thorns and blood, all the way here. Eli crouched beside him and whispered, You knew all along. Nero didn't move. He didn't have to. He had already done what no one else could. He had found the place the world wanted to forget. The evidence room was quiet, except for the soft hum of the old television and the occasional creak of a chair as someone shifted uncomfortably. The tapes they pulled from the hidden room were lined up on the table, labeled only by dates. Some were recent, some were over a decade old. Most had dust thick enough to show how long they had been waiting in the dark. Eli sat closest to the screen, his elbows on his knees, hands laced together so tight, his knuckles had gone pale. Nero lay at his feet, resting but still alert, ears twitching at every unfamiliar sound from the tiny speaker. The first tape began with static. Then came a flicker of a bare concrete wall, the corner of a mattress, the edge of a child's foot. The image was crooked, like someone had set the camera down without care. There was no talking, just a long, awful silence, then the sound of a door creaking open. A child flinched on screen. Someone in the room sucked in a sharp breath. No one spoke. Eli stared, his heart heavy. The girl on the tape wasn't Mia, but she looked just as young, just as lost. They let the tape finish. Then they moved to the next. And the next. The images changed, but the setup stayed the same. Different kids, different years. Some cried. Some sat in silence. Most didn't look at the camera. Most didn't move. One of the officers finally stood and walked out, face pale, unable to keep watching. Eli stayed. On the fourth tape, he saw something that made him lean forward, his heart stopping in his chest. A boy, maybe 6 or 7, sat on the edge of the mattress. His face was bruised, his shirt too big. And on his neck, just under his jawline, was a small brown mark, an odd-shaped birthmark. Eli knew that mark. He had seen it once, in a photo from a file that landed on his desk nearly 10 years ago. A missing boy from a town just 1 county over. The case had gone cold in 2 weeks. No leads, no suspects, no sightings. Until now. That's Michael Torres, Eli said quietly. He disappeared when I was a rookie. The room fell even quieter. The only sound the soft clicking from the old VHS machine. They started cross-checking other cases, the kids from the tapes. Some matched missing persons reports, files that had long since been pushed to the back of dusty drawers. Others didn't match anything at all. No reports, no names, just faces, kids no one had ever looked for. Or if they had, no one had looked in the right place. Eli looked down at Nero. The dog's eyes met his. None of these tapes would have been found if Nero hadn't refused to follow orders, if he hadn't clawed through the field and barked until someone listened. These kids had been hidden, forgotten. But not by Nero. He remembered what no one else did. He listened to what no one else could hear. And because of him, they were no longer just missing. They were seen, finally. The station had gone quiet. The lights above buzzed softly, and the hallway outside Eli's office was empty. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, but he didn't move. He just sat at his desk, shoulders heavy, eyes locked on the photo in his hands. It was old, edges soft and worn, the color faded over time. A girl smiled up at him from a time that felt like another life. She had her hair in braids, a gap between her front teeth, and a scraped knee that she refused to let Mom bandage. Her name was Rachel. She was 10 when she vanished. Eli was 17. He remembered the last thing she ever said to him. She had asked if he could ride bikes with her. He said he was busy, headphones in, music too loud. He never got a second chance. That photo had stayed tucked in the back of his desk drawer for years. No one at the department knew about it. He never brought it up. It was too old, too cold, too painful. But now, with the horror they'd uncovered, With the children they were slowly naming and returning to families who'd never given up hope. The photo felt heavier. He reached down and let his fingers rest gently on Nero's head. The dog was lying beside his chair, tail still, eyes half shut. He was exhausted. They all were. "You found someone else's little sister," Eli whispered, his voice thin and cracked. "No one ever found mine." Nero didn't move, but his ear twitched, listening. Eli let the words hang there for a long moment. It was the first time he'd said them aloud in almost 20 years. He hadn't even realized he was holding his breath, until it came out in a long sigh. "I used to think maybe she just ran away," he said, his voice barely louder than the hum of the lights. "That maybe she got tired of being the quiet one, the ignored one. But I knew better. I always knew. Someone took her, and nobody ever figured out who." He rubbed his eyes with one hand, the other still resting on Nero's fur. "I became a cop because I thought I could fix it. Or maybe I just wanted to punish someone. Anyone, but I never fixed anything." Nero shifted slightly, pressing closer to Eli's leg. "You didn't stop," Eli said, looking down at him. "You tore your paws open to get to that girl. You kept going when the rest of us gave up. I wish you'd been there back then." He looked again at the photo, then set it gently on the desk. "I stopped looking," he said softly. "But you reminded me why I started." In that quiet room, something cracked open in him. Not loud, not dramatic, just a slow breaking of a wall that had stood too long, the kind built by grief and silence. And beside him, Nero stayed still, watching him not like a dog, but like something older, something that understood loss in a way no one else could. Eli didn't cry, but for the first time in years, he allowed himself to remember. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beep of the heart monitor and the soft hum of machines behind the curtain. Mia sat propped up in bed, a fuzzy blanket around her shoulders and a stuffed bear clutched to her chest. Her eyes were clearer now. The dull fog that had held her in silence for days was finally starting to lift. Eli sat beside her, notebook resting on his knee, pen in hand. He wasn't pushing her, not like the others had. He just sat there and waited, speaking softly when she was ready, letting her guide the conversation. Nero lay at the foot of the bed, head resting on his paws, never looking away from her. "I remember the room," Mia said quietly, eyes staring past him. "It smelled bad, like wet wood, mold." Eli nodded. "That makes sense. The place was underground." She shifted in the bed, holding the bear a little tighter. "He used to come in late, mostly at night. I could hear his boots. He always walked slow." Eli wrote that down, glancing up at her gently. "Boots?" She nodded. "Heavy, like the kind my uncle wears for working outside." There was a pause. "Did he ever say anything to you?" She hesitated, then nodded again. "He didn't talk much, but when he did, his voice was rough. Not mean, just tired. Old." Eli's pen slowed. Mia's brow furrowed as she tried to remember more. "He smelled like something. Like smoke, but not cigarettes. Stronger, and something else. A kind of perfume, but not sweet." Eli felt his chest tighten. "What kind of smell?" "Cologne, I think," she said, wrinkling her nose. "It made my head hurt. My mom always said you could smell cheap cologne and old tobacco before you saw trouble." The words hit him like a slap. His hand froze over the page. Cheap cologne, old tobacco. He was back in his childhood hallway, Rachel standing in front of him, arms crossed, nose scrunched as she complained about the man who came over sometimes to talk to their dad. She said the same thing. Said the smell made her stomach turn. Eli leaned back slowly in the chair. His heart thudded hard against his ribs. That smell wasn't new to him. It had always lingered around one person. Someone close. Someone trusted. He whispered the name before he could stop himself. "Carl." Mia looked up. "What?" "Nothing," Eli said quickly, but his hands were trembling. "You're doing great. You're helping more than you know." Carl Brenner, his father's best friend, a man who used to give Eli quarters for gum and tell him to keep an eye on his little sister, a man who disappeared from their lives not long after Rachel vanished. Eli hadn't seen him in years, never thought to ask why. He just vanished. And now that smell was back. It wasn't just a memory, it was a thread. Eli looked down at Nero, who had lifted his head, eyes sharp and alert. The dog didn't move, but something in his stare changed, like he felt it too. The past wasn't finished, it was whispering again. And this time, Eli was listening. Eli had never seen Nero act like this. Even off duty, the dog was restless. He paced the house at night, circling rooms like something was missing. He sniffed under doors, pawed at corners, let out soft, uneasy whines that pulled Eli from sleep more than once. It wasn't normal. Nero wasn't just anxious, he was trying to tell him something. At first, Eli thought it was the aftershock of the rescue. Maybe Nero was still on edge, still shaken from the long days in the dark cellar. But the look in the dog's eyes told him it wasn't over. Not for Nero. Not for any of them. One evening, just as the sun dipped behind the trees and turned the sky a deep orange, Nero sat in front of Eli's bedroom closet. He didn't bark. He didn't move. He just stared at the door, ears forward, nose twitching. Eli stood in the hallway watching him. "What now?" he asked softly. Nero glanced back at him, then looked at the closet again. Eli opened it. Inside were old boots, winter jackets, a dusty duffel bag, and boxes stacked on the shelf. Nothing that should have meant anything. But Nero's nose went straight to the back wall. He pawed at the floorboards, claws clicking, his tail stiff and straight. Eli reached in, moved the boxes, and noticed something odd. A small square cut in the wood paneling, barely visible, like someone had once covered it, then forgotten it. His hands trembled as he pressed against it. The panel gave with a soft pop. A cold breeze slipped through, carrying the smell of old wood and forgotten air. It was a crawl space, no bigger than a small cabinet, wedged between the closet and the attic stairs. Nero pushed forward before Eli could stop him. He ducked into the hole, sniffing hard, tail swishing. Then he growled, low and steady. Eli grabbed a flashlight and followed. The air was thick with dust. Cobwebs clung to the beams above. But in the corner, wedged behind torn insulation and an old sheet, was a box. Metal, locked, but rusted enough to pry open. Eli carried it down to the kitchen table. Nero stayed close, pacing beside him. With shaking fingers, Eli forced the latch. It snapped with a crack, and the lid creaked open. Inside were tapes, dozens of them, labeled with shaky handwriting, dates, first names, ages. And near the top, wrapped in a soft cloth, was a small camcorder. Eli picked up one of the tapes. The label read, Rachel Carter, age 10, July 1996. His throat closed. He staggered back a step, barely able to breathe. Nero sat beside him, watching. Eli sank into a chair, holding the tape like it was made of glass. All these years, he thought she was just gone, lost. But she had been here, at least her name, her date, her story. Hidden just feet from where he had slept all this time. The horror he had uncovered at the farmhouse hadn't started there. It had started here. And Nero had never stopped searching, not just for Mia, not just for the others, but for her too, for Rachel. He had known, somehow, he had always known. The cruiser rolled to a stop in front of a small cottage nestled between two tall pines. It looked peaceful, like the kind of place a grandfather might spend his retirement, tending a garden and feeding birds. There was a rocking chair on the porch, a faded blue wind chime hanging from the roof, and a small stack of firewood neatly arranged by the door. Nothing about it hinted at the darkness Eli knew lived inside. He sat behind the wheel, gripping the steering wheel with one hand, the other resting on Nero's back. The dog sat tall in the passenger seat, ears forward, eyes fixed on the house. He hadn't made a sound since they turned onto the gravel road, but Eli could feel it in him, coiled energy, waiting to release. The front door opened before Eli even stepped out. A man emerged, silver hair brushed back, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. He smiled, casual, as if Eli were just stopping by for coffee. "Eli," he said warmly. "This a surprise." Eli stepped out of the car slowly, his badge clipped to his belt, his voice flat. "Evening, Carl." Carl Brenner, his godfather, his father's old partner on the force, the man who used to ruffle his hair and give him baseball cards, the same man whose name Rachel used to avoid saying, the man who vanished from their lives the year she disappeared. "You want to come in?" Carl asked, glancing at Nero. "Brought the dog too, huh? That the one from the news?" Eli didn't answer. He stepped closer. "You remember July 1996? Carl's smile faltered. "Of course I do. That was when my sister went missing," Eli said, his voice sharp now. "You were at the house that day. My dad said you came to help install the attic fan." Carl nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing. "That was a long time ago, son." Eli took another step. "I found the tapes, Carl. In your handwriting. Names. Faces. My sister's name was one of them." Something changed in Carl's face then. Just a flicker. A twitch of the mouth. A flick of the eyes toward the woods. Eli's hand dropped to his radio. "This is Detective Carter. Suspect located. Request immediate." Carl moved fast. Too fast for a man his age. His hand went for something on his hip. But Nero moved faster. The dog leapt from the cruiser like a bullet, teeth bared, body low. He hit Carl square in the chest and took him down hard onto the porch. The man cried out, struggling, but Nero had him pinned, his weight, his strength, all focused, all precise. He didn't bite, he didn't growl, he just held him there, eyes locked. Sirens wailed in the distance. Backup was seconds away. Carl stopped fighting. Eli stood over him, panting hard, not from fear, but from something deeper, the weight of truth pressing down after all these years. When the other officers arrived and cuffed Carl, Eli didn't look away. He didn't ask why. He didn't need to. He stepped back and dropped to one knee beside Nero, placing a hand on his neck. "You knew," he whispered. And for the first time in his life, Eli felt something he hadn't felt since Rachel vanished. Relief. The cornfield had grown tall again. The breeze rolled through it gently, bending the stalks in slow waves, just like it had on that day a year ago when everything changed. The farmhouse was still abandoned, its walls now wrapped in ivy, windows boarded shut, but the land around it had been cleared, cleaned, and honored. At the edge of the field, where the grass met the fence line, a small stone path led to a statue. Bronze and strong, it stood just as Nero had stood that day, chest out, head high, one paw lifted like he was taking a step forward. His nose was pointed toward the tree line, where the storm drain had been dug up and sealed. The base of the statue was simple, smooth, polished with care. The plaque read, "He didn't wait for orders, he followed the truth." Eli stood in front of it, with his hands in his pockets. The sun was warm on his back, the sky clear. Beside him, Mia knelt to place a bundle of wildflowers at the base, soft yellows and pale blues, the kind she always picked herself from behind her school. Nero stood a few feet away, his leash loose in Eli's hand. He was older now. His muzzle was graying, and the fur along his spine had thinned, but his eyes still burned with the same sharpness. He sniffed the air, ears flicking toward every distant sound, the rustle of a bird, the hum of a truck down the road, the wind shifting in the leaves. "He still remembers," Mia said softly, brushing her fingers across the bronze. "Doesn't he?" Eli looked down at her and smiled. He never forgot. After the arrest, after the tapes were logged and the victims were named, Nero had been given a medal. But Eli knew that didn't matter to him. He didn't need parades or applause. All Nero ever cared about was finding the people who couldn't call for help and bringing them back. Mia stood now, taller than she had been a year ago, her eyes bright and her voice steady. She walked up to Nero and scratched gently behind his ears. "You saved me," she whispered. "You gave me back my life." Nero leaned into her touch, his tail swaying gently. Eli watched them both, heart full. He thought of his sister, He thought of the box hidden in the attic, the names written in fading ink, the stories that had been almost lost. And he thought of Nero, how he had never given up, how he had kept digging, kept barking, kept pushing, even when no one believed there was anything left to find. Now Eli led the missing persons unit. Every time a child went missing, Nero came with him. He was slower now, sometimes stiff in the mornings, but when the moment came, when a child's scent hung in the air, he still lifted his head and listened, still scanned the wind, still followed his instincts. They visited the statue every spring, not just to remember, but to promise, to never stop looking. And every year, without fail, Nero stood before the field the same way he had that day. Still listening, still ready. If Nero's loyalty and courage moved you, give this story a like. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful true tales of the bond between humans and their animal heroes.